Diadíomh Charge, Niall from Bite Size Irish here. And since it's spooky season, today we're going to be talking about Halloween and the traditions surrounding it in Irish folklore. Who better to discuss this topic with us than my old friend and head of the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore in University College Dublin, Dr Kelly Fitzgerald. Kelly O'Cara, the Fáilte.
And Dias Melwin to everyone out there. So thank you so much for having me here, Niall.
We're honoured to have such a distinguished guest. So what people might have noticed immediately is that Kelly has an accent here. So maybe something similar to some of our own learners and subscribers. So Kelly, can you tell us a bit about your personal background, first of all?
Sure. I moved to Dublin just over 20-something years ago from Chicago originally. I was that's where I came from at the time, and I arrived to study for maybe a year or so in Ireland, and then that lasted much longer, and now I just have never left. But
so you're from an Irish American family, is that right?
Yeah, I suppose. Well, I am, but it was really interesting just growing up in Chicago and knowing a lot of people from Ireland. From the get-go, realizing that Irish American is very different than Irish, and it wouldn't have been just Irish you'd see this with. I think straight away we would notice in Chicago how the diaspora could be very different from the communities in which they would have originally come from. So I was really interested in that as well.
I suppose you could compare to like the Italian immigrant communities and so on in Chicago.
Italian or Polish or Chinese, or, you know, like, again, being so in a city like that, it was quite interesting that you would see how communities can come, and obviously they're not living back where they came from. And so they could kind of be frozen in time, and things are moving on from where they came from. And if you think of it, again, that kind of image, in particular, if you think of like a Chinatown or something like that, it is a China from some time ago. And, you know, when you think of the people who emigrated from County Mayo in the 1950s and the way they were living in Chicago, it would be very different than when you'd be in Mayo.
Sure. So the original place kind of moves on in a way, or they can diverge a little. So were you always interested in Irish culture? Was that a big thing in your family home, or did you discover that yourself?
Yeah, I suppose. So I would have been I went to art school originally, and I was an artist. And one of my first housemates was actually from India. She was studying with me, and her father was a professor at MIT. And I got really interested in Indian culture very strongly. And it was talking with her and working with her, and in a way I became an Indo-Europeanist, and I didn't realize it. So I was really into the Upanishads and Sanskrit and all of this. And it was at that time then I would have come across Kenneth Jackson's Celtic Miscellany and looking at his translations of early Irish material. And it felt really different than anything you'd see in Irish American culture. So from that point, I started really looking at early medieval imagery and literature, and that was really influencing my work as an artist in Chicago. And it got to the point that people wanted me to speak about early Irish material more than they wanted to see my artwork. So I thought I needed to do something about that. And I came and I began studying in University College Dublin.
Yes, which is where we met, of course.
Yes.
So your interests took you to University College Dublin. And how did that develop into, because you're now head of that department and head of the whole school, in fact.
Yes, I am. I know, you just never know. I think I would never have dreamt I'd be here now. And I think just everyone should know, you just never know where you could be. But I suppose, so as it happened, I studied for a BA in early and medieval Irish, and then my second subject was folklore. And those are the same two subjects you did as well, weren't they?
Yeah, early medieval Irish and Irish folklore. Yeah, that's my BA too. Yep.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And we're towards the end of that kind of BA program here in UCD. After that is it. So then I started studying. After that, then I began my work on my PhD with Niall Hogan as my supervisor, and did that. And then when Dahi took retirement in 2009, I took over his teaching from him at that point, and then so I've never left UCD.
Dahi O'Hogan that you mentioned there was a great man, author of a lot of books about folklore, and he was really into a lot of the literature, really, wasn't he?
Yes, and I mean, again, his encyclopedic knowledge was unbelievable. Many of the listeners here might be familiar with his Lore of Ireland encyclopedia. That is a real go-to. It's kind of a first stop shop for so many people in looking at elements of Irish culture. And he did really look at the material as that kind of more continuous tradition. You know, it's difficult now because I think you can't necessarily look at it as a continuous tradition, but there are definite elements that you see from the early medieval period into the more recent material collected in the folk traditions.
Yes, it's worth pointing out that while Kelly and I both studied Old Irish and Irish folklore, that they're not as connected as everybody might imagine. Old Irish really is the language from over 1,000 years ago, so it's ancient texts really. But when we talk about Irish folklore, it's material that's been collected in the last 100 years mostly. So stories collected from storytellers and songs collected and so on in much more recent times. So there's similar elements, of course, but they can also be quite different.
Yes. Yes, and I suppose, again, there's been so much attention in their similarities. I do spend a lot of time just to help people get a more nuanced sense that, again, it was a very, it's coming from, the manuscripts are the ruling classes, the elite, their concerns. And when we look at where material was collected, we're looking at much, issues around farming or the, it's a very different world is just to point that out. Yeah.
That's a really good point, because obviously folklore, it's usually what we collect from the people, from ordinary living working people.
Yes.
And the ancient manuscripts belong to the rich and powerful. That's why they were created back in the day. Fantastic. So we're going to get on to today's topic now then. So Halloween, which we mostly know as Oíche Shamhna, which is really the eve of Samhain. So that is this ancient festival, Samhain. So can you tell us something about that then, Kelly?
Yes, of course. And it's really interesting just to point out, Oíche Shamhna, that you had up there, that sense about the eve. In Ireland, the traditional days of the year, like the Hebrew calendar, begin on the evening before the day. So it's really wonderful that when we look at these aspects of what we're looking at as one of the quarter days in Irish tradition, you're saying the eve of Samhain. And Samhain, of course, is the month that happens, the month of November. And when we look at it in Irish, of course, from August, which is Lunasa, Nasa, his festival that begins in August. Then we have Manfover on to Derafover for September and October. So we have the middle of the harvest until the end of the harvest. And at the very end of the harvest, on the last day of October, we now have going into Samhain, and traditionally seen that is looking at the first day of winter in Irish tradition, and really entering into the dark half of the year. And you definitely feel it. I know when I left my house this morning, the darkness is creeping in, and again, it's almost become a cliche. You almost can. It's almost like Irish bingo, when is the first person going to mention how the evenings are creeping in? You know.
Yeah, and then we always have the alternative too in springtime. It's like when people say there's a grand stretch in the evenings, a grand stretch.
The grand stretch, exactly. And it's almost like tick the card. Yes, we've hit that time. And I suppose for many of your listeners, not being in places that are as northern as Ireland is, again, it doesn't feel as northern as it is due to the Gulf Stream that helps the weather stay a bit more temperate than it would be if we didn't have that Gulf Stream. So those connections from the Gulf of Mexico really having an impact on our weather here. So we're much more northern than that. And I think perhaps some of your listeners, if you're in North America, you do see the difference. But the nights are much longer here in the winter, and they're much and the days are much longer in the summer months here. And I think that's something that really kind of throws people when they come here.
Yeah, in my mind, growing up, New York was just opposite us, you know, just across. But really, it's not at all. And we're the same latitude as parts of northern Canada, I think.
Yes,
and New York is closer to Madrid, possibly. So
yes,
we are much more northern than. And so that gives us those long nights in winter and long days in summer too.
Yes, yes. So, and in a way that it's quite interesting that there is this kind of real break, and we are really feeling that now that we are headed into the dark half of the year. And so much, I again mentioning the quarter days, to really understand Halloween and Irish tradition, it is looking at a more holistic sense of how the year is broken up. And as I've just been speaking, as soon as I start talking about it, you know, I mentioned the previous quarter day, which is the 1st of August for Lunasa, and how we really recognize it is the end of the harvest. So those 2 quarter days, Lunasa and then Halloween, we're looking at the beginning and the end of working with the arable crops and that side of farming that was so important to Irish culture and traditions. Yes, so there we have and you see it right there. We have Lunasa, the 1st of August, Samhain, the end of October, 1st of November, Imbolc, which is St. Bridget's Day. The only one of the quarter days that have really taken on a Christian name is the 1st of February, and then Beltane, the 1st of May, being that. So we have it, and there really have, in Irish tradition, we see the seasons being broken up. So Lunasa is seen as the beginning of autumn. Samhain is seen as the beginning of winter. Imbolc is the beginning of spring, and Beltane, the 1st of May, the beginning of summer. And I know some of your listeners may be much more aware of the equinoxes and the solstices being seen as those days. And those days also fit into the Irish tradition, but just slightly different.
At a different point in the calendar.
Yes, yeah.
And every year there's a bit of discourse about, oh, you know, it's the 1st of February, spring is here. And we have friends from Britain and America saying, it's freezing, it's not. So culturally, if not in terms of the weather, it feels like spring to us from February onwards.
Yes, and just as an American from Chicago, saying the 1st of February is the first day of spring, it may not feel that much warmer, but mentally it does something for you to say this is spring now instead of waiting until mid-March. Yeah.
Okay, so those are the old traditional festivals, Lunasa, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane. They would have popped up in different points in the very ancient stories as
yes.
things that happen at certain special times of year.
And in particular, really, when we're looking at the end of October, Samhain, and then its absolute kind of other half of the year is the 1st of May. those are the two most important quarter days in terms of looking at our connection to the other world and the impact of those days. So it is quite interesting to really see the beginning of winter in Irish tradition and the beginning of summer are when we see so many traditions coming through.
So those two especially are the most significant. Samhain, 1st of November, Beltane, 1st of May.
Yeah, but exactly for the other world, for our connection to the supernatural, and that sense of that world and this world, that veil becoming much more, the thinner. The veil definitely thins. Those are the two times of the year, and hence you can see the really strong traditions that happen at those times of the year.
Okay, great. So if we focus a bit more on Samhain then, being the festival at hand, can you tell us something more about Samhain stories or traditions?
And I think Samhain is really interesting because not only, as I just spoke there about the other world and the supernatural, but this is also a time that we are really commemorating the world of the dead and those that have passed on before us, those that we are descendants of. And it's quite interesting. In tradition, the world of the dead has almost taken on almost kind of supernatural ghosts, the ghouls and the ghosts and all of that. But in Irish tradition, that world would stay very separate to the other world tradition as well. That the fairy world or what have you is very different. But I find it quite interesting that during the time of harvest, work would have been really difficult and really arduous. Bringing in the harvest is quite physical activity. And now Samhain is a time to kind of almost exhale. And it's a time to mark that you're really ready for the winter.
Ready to stop.
Yes, you have your stores, everything is kind of, the potatoes are there, the grain is there, you've brought your cattle back, they are back and they're closer to the home. Everything kind of comes in on itself. And I do think it makes sense then, this time to reflect, that you take a moment and think of where you've come from, who has come before you, and just to take that time. And in folklore, it's really important because, of course, now with the evenings becoming so dark, storytelling is huge. Coming in, and you can't busy yourself around the yard or around the farm. You really have nothing else to do but come in and come together. And I think it's just a really wonderful time to see that. And the kind of phrases that come around the storytelling side, being the dark half of the year, is what's happening.
Yeah, so this is in the days before streaming and podcasts and what have you. Of course, this was the entertainment in those long, dark evenings. And,
yes.
It makes perfect sense, doesn't it, that they would have song and stories, and in a way they're kind of sowing and harvesting and reaping the kind of culture.
Yes.
That too. Yes.
Yeah. And that sense of, and of course, this is where when we dwell on this, we're thinking they've had a good harvest. It's perhaps very difficult to think about what people would be like at the end of October when they didn't have a good harvest, and they're looking into a long, dark winter, and they don't know if they're going to make it. You could see maybe they need those wonder tales even more so, and that to just escape from it all. So it's quite interesting just put ourselves into the shoes of those who were very much a part of traditional rural agricultural society that we think about during this time.
I think something that's quite relatable in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, is how Christmas has that role now as something bright and garish. And you can have a little luxury. It doesn't matter. It's Christmas. But really, this is all out of, it's so dark in the winter. And we need a little something, don't we?
I couldn't agree more. And if you think of it, it's that Christmas candle is such an important tradition then for that. And in a way, Halloween, we don't really focus on bringing in the light in that way that we do for Christmas. We kind of indulge ourselves of engaging with the darkness. You know, we love it. What can happen in the dark? And it allows us to kind of parallel our behavior and being tricksters and all of that being hidden in the dark. That's what allows us. And that sense of our connection to the other world here at Halloween, you know, representing or almost like reflecting or mirroring that culture in the way that we behave.
And just to take another North American slant too, I've always wondered, but I never actually asked the question or found out. But of course, in Mexico, they have this strong tradition of the dead around the same time of year too.
Absolutely.
Is that an indigenous Mexican thing, or is that a Catholic thing?
Well, it's very Catholic now, of course, and but that whole sense of the Day of the Dead, but it is in the northern hemisphere, looking at it just above the equator, that it is that time of the year when autumn has come and the world, you know, your agricultural season is ending. And so you are, it makes sense to give time to the dead as the work, as there is decay everywhere around you at that time.
Just as the opposite would obviously be true. And we always associate springtime with new birth and new life and, you know, rabbits and eggs and Easter and all of that, you know,
and calving. And again, just to go back, as I was talking about the arable crops this half of the year, of course, the 1st of February and the 1st of May have all to do with animal husbandry and your milk and your milk profit, and all of that is connected to that half of the year.
Wow. So in terms of Halloween traditions per se, what can you tell us about what used to happen in Ireland around Halloween?
Yes, so when we think of it, there's a lot going on. First, when I was thinking of it, and perhaps, of course, mentioning the supernatural, on the one hand, that sense of divination is much more prevalent. Similar again for the beginning of May, that because we're so connected to the other world, that it is a sense that things can be a bit heightened. So when I think of that, when we think of really the traditional games in Ireland, it is that sense of divination. And perhaps a tradition that still stays is the barmbrack, this kind of caked bread.
I have one sitting over there. Yeah.
Do you? Does it have a gold ring in it?
I'm afraid it doesn't. I think my girlfriend has been in and taken that gold ring out and thrown it over the hedge. But no, it's just from the shop. But I love the barmbrack, of course, the speckled loaf, lovely Irish loaf.
And I love that it's that brack. Quite often in Irish tradition, something that is speckled has otherworldly qualities to it. So it is that when we think of when in storytelling, if something is referred to as that brach, the speckled part of it, the baran being the loaf, the brach there being the speckled, we see that that has a really, as soon as you hear that, it is an indicator that this is something from the other world, and that this is a cake like no other, that it has gifts to bestow into our world. And that, of course, is the sense of divination. Now, interestingly enough, the gold ring, of course, the signifier for marriage, has remained. And perhaps it shows we only like divination in the positive now. But of course, when we go back and we look at Irish traditions, it wasn't always a positive outcome in what could happen. You know, there are other, various other objects could be found in the barmbrack that would, you know, perhaps give you the sense that you're going to have a life of poverty, you're going to have a life of hardship, other elements there. We see that this sense of divination can come across in various other ways of looking at it, and there's this kind of imagery of you know, of party goers coming together, and they have a blindfold on and they're pointing at various dishes, and whatever dish they point at, if it's a dish of water, they may be emigrating, yes,
water.
Water, going across the water. We are an island here. And I think it's quite interesting to see the kind of local variations on that, and how that is seen. So yes. So divination.
One quite famous example, of course, of these divination games at Halloween is a short story by James Joyce from the classic collection Dubliners. It's called Clay. And, they play these games at Halloween. And this is so Joyce is more associated with the city, of course, but his people were from Cork, and a lot of those country traditions were around even in Dublin in those days, of course, too.
And then, of course, because the divination, the finding of clay, of course, is again, that aspect of the death and the graveyard with it. Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting. Pardon?
Cray na Killa is another famous novel in Irish about the churchyard clay, so signifying death, basically. Yeah.
Yes. So we have that being that side of it, and I think it's quite interesting, the divination of death being around when you are really thinking about the dead, and this sense again of families really cleaning the house, and that the souls of the departed would come back on this evening into the home and welcoming them again. And you kind of have this kind of parts being written, this image of imagining all the souls, because of course All Souls Day, All Saints Days, these are the days that come after Iahon, the religious traditions that have
November.
Yes. So all of that is happening at this time, much importantly. And I think perhaps it's really important to point out to people, when the sense of purgatory and the belief in time spent in purgatory was very strong, of course, theologically speaking, purgatory still does exist in the Roman Catholic faith, but perhaps people's engagement with it or beliefs in it may not be as strong. But when we think of that, and people spending time there, that that sense that you don't move on to the next world really until you've fulfilled all your duties, or
they were felt to be, those souls in purgatory were felt to be closer.
Yes, very much so.
Wow.
That's so again, if ghosts, again, that sense of ghosts being still not in that liminal space that purgatory is between heaven and earth, and that they are the ones they are if you have a ghost, it is someone who is still quite often now we think of ghosts as people seeking revenge on their death, this kind of avenging
unfinished business.
Unfinished business. But it could be, if a priest who will say my mass, of course, is a very strong tradition and legend of the soul of the priest still appearing at midnight in the church, because there are masses that have been paid for that he has not said, so he cannot move on. And I kind of always love that tradition, that even no one is above doing their, fulfilling their duties and obligations on this world.
Well, I expect people might have liked that notion that even the priests were subject to this, because they did have a lot of power in the old days.
Yes. So we think of that. And so on the one hand, we have that divination, but of course that brings people together, and the merrymaking side of Halloween. And I think it's quite interesting. I know Christmas gets a lot of attention now, and Christmas, though, is such a family holiday. It may be the 26th, if you're perhaps in Munster or various places, which has the much more community-based, or if you're thinking of Ulster, the mumming that happens before Christmas. But Christmas itself is very, Christmas itself is very family-based. But Halloween is for the community. It is really about coming together as a community. And you may have had a special meal at home. Think of it, the the food is just, yeah. Again, food is always good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Big nab of butter and a big particle cannon is gorgeous, right?
Mm.
So that may be happening in the house, but that sense of, as we would call it, guising, the beginning of the mumming season. So of course, mumming would not happen in the days of light. So the second half of the year, really going from Halloween on to, you could argue, until Bridget's Day, with the Biddy Boys being a form of mumming, but very strongly mumming around Christmas and Stephen's Day, depending on where you are in Ireland. But that season begins with Halloween and the Halloween geysers.
So can you tell, for all of our listeners, they might not all be familiar with this word mumming. So
Mumming.
What do you mean when you talk about mumming then?
So mumming is the most kind of general term to speak of masking, that you are, like to mum, to quiet, or to hide, or to disguise. So if we call that, again, the mummers or the geysers, they are in disguise. These figures that are up, and this is, again, playing into that element of trickery and tomfoolery and all this excitement that can happen. These days allow people to behave in a way. Behavior is an unacceptable behavior on any normal day is now perhaps more acceptable now. It still can add, people can still get upset about it or be a little bit annoyed.
Well, I was just at, just about a month ago, I was at the wedding of a close friend in the west of Ireland. And during the evening, after all the speeches and the first dance and all of that, everyone was well on, shall we say. But at a certain point, a bunch of people burst into the room wearing masks, and they were all dancing around in a circle and pulling people around for a little bit, and then they disappeared again. So this was, I was told this is the West Clare side of the wedding was very strong for this.
I have been in weddings in Clare as well with those. And it's quite interesting, again, in Irish traditions. That could have been traditionally people who are upset that they weren't invited to the wedding. It gives a bit of excitement and entertainment to the wedding. All of that kind of comes with it. It comes back again, funerals, anyone is allowed to attend. That is the community. The wake is the community coming together. Whereas weddings are a little bit more difficult, and you do need an invite for them. So we have the straw boys for the weddings, and that straw, that sense of guising coming through in that element, and that kind of something that falls outside of perhaps the mumming, as you're saying, going there in the summertime for that. But so that sense, maybe people think of it as costume party or fancy dress or the various terms that they may use for it, and still very much associated. There we go, the clever looking for the straw boys. And we see
one of the terms. I'm sure there's a lot of terms for this kind of thing.
Yes, loads. And we see then that we now associate it more internationally with Halloween, but to really understand the Irish tradition, it is a part of a much larger kind of cycle of where this kind of cultural engagement is manifested. Yeah,
so in a roundabout way, that leads us to modern senses of dressing up at Halloween and so on. Now, one of the other traditions we had growing up was the bonfire, and I lived in England for a long time, and a lot of people there didn't seem that familiar with Halloween traditions at all. And in fact, they usually considered it a very American innovation, which was odd to me because, of course, my mother told stories about all of this stuff from the 1940s and 1950s. So it's just, it depends on which region you're from, I suppose. But that was in London.
Yes, and I think
all the fires. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I think it's quite interesting that Guy Fawkes Day has kind of taken over the bonfire in England or in the United Kingdom.
Just a week later.
Yes, because that's the 5th of November. Isn't Guy Fawkes Day the 5th of November?
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting. And calendars, whenever I start to try and figure out the 12 days that were moved, or when we look at the calendars, I get very confused. But it's quite interesting that that has become the bonfire night in there, and perhaps earlier traditions of it happening at the end of October could have been there or may have been there, but we don't see it. But of course, bonfire is just bone fire. Is this real sense of bones being burnt. And that is the kind of etymology behind it. And again, when we look at the quarter days, this sense of fire, do you keep the fire or do you share the fire? Is another aspect that we see. And definitely for Halloween, you share the fire. You definitely share the fire. In Dublin here now, the Dublin Fire, firemen have created a kind of an interactive map of where bonfires are happening. Now they're putting them up there, I think, in like a warning sign. I, as a folklorist, see their map as like a wonderful tool to see where these traditions are still happening. And it's very strong in Dublin, definitely.
Yeah, for me growing up in the countryside in Tyrone, it was really all about the build-up to Halloween, and it was a literal build-up because for weeks and weeks and weeks, you and your gang of friends in your neighborhood were collecting wood, stealing pieces of wood from places you shouldn't be, and things like that. Even tires from farms, from old tractors and things, to make the biggest fire. Everyone wanted to have the biggest fire, and then that was all of the escapades, we were getting up to. And then on Halloween night itself, you're looking around. We have our fire; it's very big, but you can see on that hill the other kids from the other neighborhood and so on. And it was the best fun, really.
It's amazing, and again, it's quite interesting to see that. Another night we think of the big bonfires would be on St. John's Eve in June, would be another time. And again, I think it's quite interesting to do a map and see if you have that night for St. John's, is it still a big tradition for Halloween or perhaps not? And if you think of it in the kind of more loyalist traditions, the bonfire night, of course, is the 12th of July as opposed to the end of June. So we see it's as we were talking there, Guy Fawkes Day, it's just really interesting to look, and what seems very different, maybe a slight variation of what is kind of commemorated or celebrated.
And to go to another one of the quarter days again, would there have been bonfires for May Day as well, for Beltane?
Well, see, because when Tina is in the title, and there are traditions of kind of cattle being driven through the fires for Beltane, and this sense of that. But then it's quite interesting because Beltane, of course, is the day you should never share anything from your home. Like you wouldn't even let a neighbor come in and borrow, light their pipe from your hearth, from your fire, because you need to keep it all together due to the kind of ill luck that could be brought upon you if they have anything in that kind of sympathetic magic that we think of for May Day.
I had to ask about Beltane because we have a lovely turn of phrase, "Nachkaintse" in Irish, "Idir ja hinne Beltane." So literally that "Idir ja hinne Beltane," literally it means between two fires of Beltane. Like the cattle being driven through them.
Yep.
The way we use it is if you don't know which one to choose, this or that, if you're in a dilemma.
Yes, exactly.
So this is not an Irish phrase. Yep. So you hear that in the Irish. Great. So the fireworks and the fire and costumes. Are there any other Halloween traditions that you think are significant that are worth talking about there?
Well, I think it's really interesting if we think of it, the games that are made, particularly like when we think of the harvest, it's the time of apples, and the material culture may not have been strong, but they made the most out of it. And bobbing for apples is something many of your listeners may be aware of. but
Sure.
all of those kinds of traditions of you know, kind of various different, it's all the kind of party games that we still think of for Halloween. When you look at it, they a lot of those are coming from older traditions and would be using that. So coming through, I'm seeing kind of apples being hung by strings, and you're trying to kind of grapple that.
Yeah.
In America, of course,
yeah.
In America, that has turned into a donut. You know, so again.
Well, I was just thinking there that we used to have toffee apples at Halloween, but now the toffee wouldn't have existed in the old days. But
no,
that was a big thing when I was a child.
Think of that. And toffee, just that melted sugar and putting that melted sugar. Oh, they're gorgeous, aren't they? Taffy apples still being a very strong thing in North America. It is quite interesting, that sense. And you were just talking about that. And I know Ireland is very keen to kind of take back the kind of traditions of Halloween, or letting people know that it isn't just this kind of American invention. But I do think, I do like to point out that when, you know, when people emigrate to America, when Europeans emigrate to America, autumn in America, well, fall, as they call it. So we can, if I refer to fall, I'm over there. It's so, the colors are so vivid, just the way in which the leaves have a different aspect. So it's quite interesting to see that people left, and they left a lot of traditions, and they left perhaps certain things that weren't revived or became a part of. But when they went there, American, the end of the harvest, and the harvest being so important, of course, we think of the American holiday, Thanksgiving, being a part, that kind of celebration of the harvest or the end of the harvest, that being the very strong tradition there. But looking at that, so you're looking at what becomes important in America due to different ways of what's happening there, but drawing on earlier traditions, and then just due to the kind of global impact that America has.
The conditions that led to the nature of Halloween, or Samhain here in Ireland, weren't so different in North America, where you had the same, roughly the same seasons and harvest at the same time.
Yes. And also, when we think of, in that very Protestant puritanical sense of America, the headless horseman, and that whole image of the jack-o'-lantern, and all of that we can find very strong parallels in Ireland, became huge cultural touchstones or icons within the American tradition as well from that period.
There's something about folklore, when we use the very word folklore, is that it makes us all think of the olden times, you know, and it's kind of a little quaint old image. But we could also talk about ethnology, because it's a study of culture and human behavior in all of these situations. So folklore, when you study it, it does include modern life, doesn't it? And modern exchanges of culture and so on. So thinking of Halloween still, do you see that a lot of interplay between places now?
Oh, yes, yes. And I think it's still quite, it's wonderful. We talk about contemporary material, you know, Halloween is stronger now in Ireland than perhaps ever was. Perhaps it's because it's the midterm for the school, kids are off, they kind of make a marker of it. And I think, again, the importance of having special days to mark behavior being slightly different, to have these kinds of costume parades for schools, and kids really getting involved in how they dress up, and parents getting very involved in that. We definitely see it. And again, the folklorist in me would say, well, who's collecting this material? Because in a way, people feel like, oh, that's from long ago, and you know, and the National Folklore Collection is an amazing resource, which of course you and I drew on so much in our studies, and I continue to draw on so much. But it makes you realize what isn't being collected, and if people 100 years from now really want to understand what Halloween was like in the beginning of the 21st century, where is the material for that? So it's very important for us to remember.
Instagram, I suppose.
But I think as soon as I said it, and again, how, will it exist? Where will we be able to access it, or what have you? But all of that, and that time, it is that kind of time in the year when you need to have a break and make something of it.
It's good to have that break kind of midway between the end of summer and the end of the year.
And winter, yes, yeah. The full on winter, yeah.
Great. Well, you just mentioned the National Folklore Collection, so I'm thinking, I'm sure, Kelly, that there'll be a lot of people watching this now thinking this is fascinating. I'd love to find out more. We have so many listeners who are interested in all aspects of Irish culture, as well as the language, of course. So if someone's interested in Irish folklore, do you have any recommendations for them? Could you tell them where they could go or what they could read to find out?
Well, first and foremost, just it may be difficult, but like to look at the website that is just wonderful, www.dúchas.ie. Dúch is literally the heritage, the heritage that we have it there.
Yeah. Heritage.
And it's a fantastic site there. It just was a new site was recently launched over the summer. But if you look at the top there, you can just put in, if you were to just put in Halloween into the search bar there, if you're looking at English with 2 L's for the Hallow.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes. Do you have, I think, do you have it spelled Hall? Yes, you do. But look at that, and it's quite interesting. Of course, the 11th of November is St. Martin's Day, another important day in Irish tradition, and it's quite interesting that popped up. But look at all that. People could see the games, the customs. There is so much, and that's in English, let alone the much greater corpus of material in Irish that is found.
Now I'd like to just mention something, Kelly. There's the main manuscript collection. There's 4 returns. The photographic collection, 10 returns, but 706 returns. Most of these are from the schools collection.
Yes.
What is that? Kadishan? Can you tell us about the schools collection?
Well, the schools collection is kind of the core. The main manuscript material is only coming on stream now, but Dúchas does come from a digitization scheme 10 years ago now. It'll be 10 years that Dúchas has been up at the end of this year. And it's really, look at how wonderful it is. So much of it has been transcribed, as you see there on the right-hand side of the manuscript. So look at that manuscript there. These are materials that were submitted to the precursor of the folklore collection, the Irish Folklore Commission, from 1937 to 1938, some of it into 1939, from the schools around Ireland, where the kind of end of primary schools, as they would have been at the time, would have been collecting material in Ireland and doing it as their work, but actually collecting. If you look at it there, we see that the collector is a Kathleen Flannery. She's collecting from a John Flannery. We see this in County Galway. He's 48. I'd say she is collecting from her father. And he would be telling her, I'd say, things that happened in his own childhood for Halloween. Just that, look at that Halloween. In this district, kind of on that night, several games are played by the young children. Long ago, the young and the old people used to take parts in the games, but nowadays the games, are.
We came on this particular example because I searched for Halloween, like the English word, but of course you could search for Samhain.
And, that's what I meant. Sorry, go much.
I'd like to share one of my favorite pages.
Yes.
For very personal reasons. This one, as you can see, it's in Irish. It's in the old script. And some of the spellings are old-fashioned too, but isn't it beautiful?
Yes, yeah.
That's weather lore, weather folklore.
And
We
again,
also
that sense of
like,
divination.
Halloween traditions. Halloween is mentioned there, but I love this particular one because I have to point out something for everyone watching, just of pure personal family pride. This was collected by a little girl called Myra Neelaharty. You can see there, Myra Neelaharty. And she didn't know it yet, but she was going to become my grandmother in a number of years afterwards. So that's my granny there when she was a little girl in 1938.
1938. So, and look at how fantastic was her handwriting.
Yeah, beautiful.
I always make a comment about that.
So I always feel that if people, you know, if you know someone in your family was living in Ireland in the 1930s, if they were primary school age, then they could be in that collection. I found a couple of family relatives, which was.
So where were your family members then, Niall?
Yeah, because I'm from Tyrone, and unfortunately, the 6 counties in the north were not included, sadly. No. But my mother is from Connemara, so that's from the Galway side.
Okay.
And my granny, when I discovered that material about, you know, when I was in the department over 20 years ago, and at the time my granny was sadly gone, but my granddad was still alive. So we managed to show him some copies of that, and it was amazing for him to see, you know, something that the family didn't know existed at all. So
yes.
It's a fantastic resource in its own right, but also there are a lot of these human connections and stories too.
Yes, and if people, and just to let people know, in particular, so much, I know you were showing the Shanklo there, and it's just beautiful, the handwriting. But if you notice to the right that piece has been transcribed, were you the one who transcribed it?
I probably took a look at it, all right, to make sure it was okay.
Yes, yes, yes. But it's interesting, again, just to let our listeners know that if there's an area of Ireland that they have their family from, and if they find the material in Irish, that it's great to see that it's actually been transcribed into Irish that has, you know, all the shevus and that have been added to it.
The Irish is still an older.
It's not the It's not Kaijan, but it's full script.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's lovely to see the old script. That's how people just used to write until the 1940s or 50s, I think. Well, I think my mother was still doing the Shanklo at school in the 1950s.
Yes.
But with typewriters and things like that, we did adopt the Roman script.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Which is fair enough, but it's nice to have that old one too. So that's duchas.ie. Really worth a look if you're interested in Irish folklore. So I'll put that link up again for you. That's what we were just looking at. There's a lot of stuff you could while away a few winter afternoons there easily enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think again, like you put in some terms in Irish, see what comes up. These are schools collection is a great way for learners because you are looking at young people's writing. So some of the material is not as difficult, you know, particularly when you look at it, when you get used to the spellings, you'll start to see that. So yeah, I definitely recommend that for people. Spend time. There's a lot of English material on it as well, as we recognize how bilingual this island has been, but really it's a fabulous resource for Irish material. Absolutely wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of other resources or things that people could use, I believe the folklore department had a podcast. Is it still going? I think it's still going.
Yep, Learning Vela, this is still there. Yes, I don't know if it's been very active lately, but yes, they're still on SoundCloud.
Yeah, I think it's available on all podcast
yes, I'd say so.
Platforms. So now, depending on the topic, this one sometimes it's all in Irish, but I think I've heard some interviews and talks where it's more bilingual as well.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So blurrini bailadish, little scraps and morsels of folklore.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
we might say. Lovely. Well, Kelly, mila mahigad as lin in you. Thank you so much for sharing all of your fantastic insights into this festival, which you know, it is really important here, but it's one that's so important internationally that it really helps Ireland engage with the world. So it's got a really special place on the calendar for me, I think.
Oh, and thank you, Niall. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and all the very best. And again, it's quite interesting to think of it. I was just thinking, a colleague of mine in Israel just sent me a Happy New Year message this week. So it is kind of interesting to think of Halloween as the kind of end of the year, and we're going into the next half of the year. So all the very best to you in our next half of the year.
Well, hopefully we'll dive into that Bahrain Brack and find some good news there.
Good news. You'll find the gold ring, Niall.
Okay. Slán gat dinner.
Slán.
Check out Bite Size Irish courses and resources at bitesize.irish.